In this video, we're going to be discussing an image I made that I call the Metaformal Cosmogram, which is based off of Galahad Eridanus's Abraxian Cosmogram, which kind of discusses the mediation between polarities within reality, and it does this through these symbolisms with the tree of life and the life of Jesus, and that is combined in the symbol of Abraxas, which is essentially the unity of opposites. And that was a very compelling image to me, and I decided to start working on something similar. I drew this a couple of months ago, which is an earlier version of what you can see on the screen, and basically what that was just an attempt to get down my vision, like, viscerally, of what reality looks like. And I'm not talking about what experience is like, not what the sight of what I'm seeing actually in physical reality is, but how it takes shape and shadow internally. How do things move from the one to the many? And what I ultimately found was that that unity has to be at the center of everything. It is the central sun of our reality, which is why it's put up there right at the top. And at the center is this kind of idea of one, is that any multiple of 2 to the n minus 1 in the first three, at least the first three figures in that series, which are 0, 1, 3, and 7, are all incredibly significant when we're thinking about theology. This is something that was realized by the Indian genius Ramanujan, who is a mathematical prodigy. Basically, 2 to the n minus 1, if it's 0, then that is basically this space of potential which is waiting to be potentiated by infinity. If it is 1, then that is the infinite creator. If it's 3, that's the Trinity. And if it's 7, then that is talking about completion. And that's a common symbol that you see in the Bible, and often other numerical things will turn up with these values of 7 when it's meant to symbolize completion, such as the 7 days of creation. Even the 7 days of the week is based on that, but then this recurs over and over again. So next to that is the Aya, which is I will be, or rather, it is being. So basically, what the phrase which is used in Exodus when God is talking about, like, how does his internal self model work? Moses has to prove to the Israelites that there is one infinite creator, and he's proving this to a bunch of pagans who aren't interested in any of this stuff and haven't been basically for hundreds of years, since the time of Abraham. So Aya and the other patriarchs. So Aya, Asher Aya, is saying that the attribute is repeated as the instance. So that means that God self-configures and self-initiates through this tautology of I am equals I am. So it's literally Aleph Haya, which is the Aleph, the inception point of existence, the first letter in the alphabet, and then Haya, which just means existence. So existence equals existence, is that God is setting himself up as this super tautology. So that's why Rabbi Moses Maimonides, one of the most famous Jewish philosophers, translates this not as I am that I am, but rather the existing one exists, or the existing being is the existing being. And that above that, anything that is one has to also be infinite, because infinity is this undifferentiated potential, but that is ultimately monic. So it doesn't make sense to separate unity and infinity. They have to be coupled within one ultimate identity. And so that's why we refer to God as the one infinite creator, is that God totally moves between those two concepts seamlessly, is both that infinitary perspective on reality and totally unbound, but also one. So this is resonant throughout the entire cosmos. So if you're one, that means there can't be any parts or break. There can't be anything that extends over you. And that means you have to be infinite, because you contain everything within it. So so all of these are basically different ways of expressing the reality principle, is that the intention of reality equals the extension of reality. For with respect to the Hebrew words, the first I am, the I am that I am, is the intention, and the second is the extension. The phrase indicates that those are self-dual to one another. Same with one and one, written out as literary expressions, are two, basically ways of denoting the intention and the extension of the monic self-dual identity of reality, and then that all comes together within an ultimate unity within the central sun of our universe, which is then infinitely extended outwards, and there's no real is self-initiating, meaning that there is no essentially atemporal. So there's nothing external to God in which you can have anything emerge. So defining God as the one infinite creator basically means that is subtends all of existence. Panentheism is kind of a given, because there's no way you could say that the universe is outside of God, because that would be limiting God's creative power and authority. So then one level down from that is God's internal self model. And the way that God does this is through the logos, which is this classical Greek word, which technically just means the word, but it actually has a greater meaning than that in both Greek and Christian theology. Is that logos is basically the linguistic identity of reality. It is the language of the universe by which it self-configures. So through the logos, through the control language of reality, God identifies with a subset of himself as God the creator, and then God can start to turn outwards, and this is when you first have these first simmerings of this SCSPL, of this self-processing, self-configuring language that takes this ultimate majesty of God and then channels that into, more concrete emanations. And then one level below that, so once we get to the logos, which is basically any logical restraint on the one infinity, is you have this this level of self-knowledge, which is in the Kabbalistic tree of life is Chokmah, Bina, and Da'at, which is basically these three different nodes on the Kabbalistic tree of life, on that descent. And what Moses Maimonides says is that God is just knowledge, knower, and known. And you'll notice that's not at the top, because that's only true at an intermediate level. This is only true at the level of those three, but ultimately God in that system is Ein Sof, is without limit, is the infinite creator. But proximally, God takes on the garments of the knower, the knowledge of the known, of this process of self-knowledge and self-relation through which knowledge and being are linked, and God basically initiates it himself as a system for self-knowledge, and then the further emanations that God goes through these ideas of love and severity and beauty and so forth are all part of God's channeling of himself into the material creation, into his presence in reality, which is called malchut, which is called kingdom, which is then actually still the perfect reflection of Keter, of the ultimate aspect of God that is immediately following the Ein Sof. So Keter and Malchut are coupled. God in this transcendent sense and God as a presence within his material creation are still the same entity. All of this is one. That is the key. If you look at only one thing in this image, look at the central sun. Look at the one. And this is Otheos agape. This is literally this phrase means God is love. That means that one level below Chokmah and Bina and Da'at, God is love. God is chesed. God is loving kindness. And this is why it's talked about in the Psalms. It says, it says, Tov Adonai lakol v'rachamav kol ma'asav. That good is God to all, and compassion is over all of his inner workings. And it also says, Sadik Adonai b'chol derachav. Righteous is God in all of his ways. Sadik Adonai b'chol derachav v'chasid b'chol ma'asav. And loving kindness is over all of his workings. So compassion and loving kindness are essentially what the universe is a self-representation of, it's taking these ideas of love and freedom and making a terminal reality out of them in which various identities can cohere. So ultimately, the purpose of existence and the purpose of God's creation is the coherence of all of these separate beings, to realize that they're interdependent on one another, and to live within this story of interbeing, where we can see that we're all interconnected in ways that aren't discernible on this plane of existence, but we are united because we are all children of the one creator God. So that's why love and understanding are actually fundamental to reality. They're not something that emerges at the human level, but is actually quite fundamental. So right next to that, we have this idea in Neoplatonism of nous, is that in order to have the knower, the knowledge, and the known, you have to have this mental structure. You have to have nous. You have to have a universal mind, which is described in Neoplatonism as the light by which the one sees itself. Is that it's basically, it has this light which emanates, and the and so how does it see? And so how does the one see itself? It has to remove itself. It has to get this mind level, and then it has to look back at itself. And the way it does this in the CTMU and in John Wheeler's participatory universe model is through this idea of a self-excited circuit, is that it does this through its secondary images. So God then has this drive to author this creation, which is basically for the purpose of the self-identification and self-seeing of the God system, of the reality. So reality is trying to see itself, and it does this through its secondary observer participants, which then parameterize the laws of physics, which then break through the quantum information that they provide through their observer participancy, just like in quantum mechanics, where the observer is providing information to that which is observed, and then that information and that physics then goes and creates a universe that is specifically parameterized to bring about observer participancy. And ultimately, the way that the universe does this is through creation of life and sentient agents whose freedom reflects the fundamental freedom of reality, and therefore able to exist as participatory agents in the system. So the light by which the one sees itself is actually, basically within us. It's the light of consciousness. And so this level of universal mind is absolutely fundamental to how we have to think about God. And then that origin point, which is then basically retroactively created by that observer participancy, is that it's this closed loop where you can't really say where it starts, but at some point we have both this origin and we have the later observer participants, and they are actually bring one to the other. But that's quite interesting. And that origin point becomes then the closed grammar of the self-processing, self-configuring language of the logos. Is that logos is then identified with that origin point, which is distributed over literally everything in reality. It's that closed SCSPL grammar, just like in the Hawking-Hartle hypothesis with the no boundary proposal, is that we want to say that there is no temporal origin point, because once you get this positive t variable, once you don't treat time as negation but multiply it by an imaginary metric such that you can have an x squared plus y squared plus z squared plus t squared manifold. So basically time is then a positive structuring force in reality, which is part of that observer participancy, and it's basically acts as the state transition syntax on reality. Is that distributed origin point then goes back, and it's basically a distributed creation event, because that grammar that brings reality into existence has to adhere within every point within that self-contained manifold. So there's really it is truly we say God is the first and the last, then there's none else beside him. And that's actually entirely true, is that God is the one infinite creator, God is ultimate reality, and God's creation is infinitely creating. So there's a self-processing, self-configuring language that is basically the internal identity language of God, which then that gets mirrored into this earth state, into this primordial state of existence, which is then fractionated into this world of forms and the world of representations. The world of forms, as it's called in Platonism, is actually called in CTMU the syntactic metaverse, which is this space of design and potential, which is acted upon by this non-terminal programming domain. And it's basically this world where metaphysical consciousness is able to program the physical universe, and then the universe then instantiates those space-time corporeal displays and there's this telic recursion between the syntax and states where each mutually refines one another, and truly there's no ultimate separation because they are both the thing. They are both the origin point of reality. So the formal and the manifest are actually coupled within a broader domain, which is basically how we define reality, is as the coupling of this non-terminal and terminal domain as the intention and extension of reality, respectively. So the intention you can think of as kind of the higher levels of this, where there's this spirit world of design and programming, and then the extension is the physical universe that we know of. So there is a grammar called the mumorphism that attaches God to his secondary images that you can see here with I superimposed it on the painting Creation of Adam by Michelangelo, because it's basically about the connection between God and humans. But then the mumorphism also functions as the state transition syntax for reality itself. So reality is constantly reconfiguring based on the relationship of the primary teller, God, to each of the secondary tellers, and thus it is essentially a system that is designed to take the needs of secondary tellers into account and fulfill them through the state transition syntax. So if we are able to use our powers of agentive telic recursion to affect the primary telic recursion in the best way through following the generalized value of what God is trying to do in the creation, then we are participating positively in the structure and dynamics of the universe, and then we are connected back to God. And so if you don't sever that mumorphic mapping, then you are essentially identified with the creator, and you're golden. But the problem is when you have like this mortal sin, is because it's literally cutting you off from the source of life. So that's why it's called a mortal sin. So that here in this box, I take kind of the each of the words in the one infinite creator. The is a definite article, of course, and that indicates that God is definite. God is not, it's not a one infinite creator, it's the one infinite creator. God is the subject, God is the identity of reality. There's no escape from God. One, God is one, of course, that's the primary article of faith in the Bible. It says that Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. God is alternatively called the source, the monad. Monad literally means the one. The one becomes two, the one becomes many for the joy of becoming one again. So the ultimate basis and purpose of everything in reality is unity, and for the creation, for the multiplicitous and variegated creation and all its colors and beauty, to all find its essence in unity. And to do it, and it does this because the creation has to, in order to refine and renew the identity of the one infinite creator, has to be self-dual to it, and that means that it is constantly evolving to try to get back to the creator. And so that is ultimately the purpose of us secondary tellers. If you look back at this mumorphic mapping, is that we are supposed to take the earth and then we're supposed to give it back as a gift to God through the mumorphic mapping, through the ultimate summit of earthly knowledge that resides within our hearts and souls. And then we can give this world back as a gift to God. And, this will be beautiful and wonderful. And it's this consummation event where, this is what Zechariah talks about in the Bible. He says, on that day, God will be one and his name one. And his name one means that we're not going to mistake any, division or this kind of strange like polarization within in God or between God and man, but rather we will be quite united, and the knowledge of God shall be over all of the earth. So knowledge is getting us back to this this universal logos event, is that we need the knowledge of God, we need the logos in order to live in a shared reality and know how to do this. And to live in a shared reality and to do that properly means living within a monic reality and recognizing the synetic relationship of everything in existence. And that means we are living in communion with and service to every being in existence. And that is when we got it made, is when we can do that. So it says, the knowledge of God shall be over the earth as the waters fill the sea. There will be, it literally cannot go deep enough into God's knowledge. So in the one infinite, it is infinite. There is no end to God's end. God is the first and the last. God is the infinite. God is how the infinite expresses itself in the world, and God is the relationship, the self between that duality. So God is the infinite source of everything in existence. God is how the infinite expresses itself in the world, and God is the relationship between the expression and the source. So there, God is trialically infinite. There is this relation allows for this constant, infinite expanse to never be exhausted. God is a creator, and God has basically four things about him, which are symbolized by the four archangels, which are or four of them, which are Mikael, who is like God, Gavriel, who is as strong as God, the Oriel, who is as light, Oriel, which is like the light of God, Ori meaning light, El meaning God, and and uh and I said Oriel, Gavriel, Mikael, and there's definitely one other, um or oh, and Raphael, which is like the healing of God. So all of those things are basically four aspects of the action of God in the world. Is that angels are basically this distributed authority with which God shares his creative power and influence, not as everything is within God's control, but just and angels are created beings. They're not separate from God, but they're basically part of God's internal self model, and they don't have the same degree of freedom as we do, even though they're more coherent, let's say. So God is answering four questions. He's who, which is basically identity. Who is God? This is what we're trying to answer. Strength, which is omnipotence. That is Gavriel, Gaver El. Light, which is knowledge, the light by which the one sees itself, the knowledge of the knower and the known, and healing, which is this kind of idea of omnibenevolence. God is not only omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient, but God is also omnibenevolent. God is the very standard for good. So then the acts and energies of God, the life, consciousness, personality, will, existence, power, glory, kingdom, wisdom, are all basically synonyms for the ultimate essence of God. So those all flow back ultimately and find their source in giving shape and shadow to the one. So everything is part of this monic system. Everything is part of the one infinite creator. But God has these emanations, but they are synonyms for his essence. So God is that being in whom essence and existence are one and the same. So that means God is ultimately a simple entity because God has all of these things. Like for me, my personality and my wisdom could be, or my wisdom and my strength are two totally different things. But for God, they're actually one and the same because they both are just God. There's nothing separate from God within God's wisdom. So everything, all of these emanations are really non-emanations. They're just called that. They're just the ways that we can think about God through these different perspectives. But that's relative to us. Relative to God, they are absolute, and the same holds true for the energies of God in creation, the logi, the basically sub logoses, that the sub languages of reality, through which reality programs and creates itself, and these kind of internal languages to the self configuration of reality, which is also the same thing as like a primary telic recursive parameter in the CTMU parlance. That's all God. God is doing everything because God is basically the infinite creator, and that means that all of that creation is responsible to God and by God. So at the very top, we have here on the left, almost like a little guide is at the top you have God's essence. And I have a quote from the Book of Psalms by King David. It says, "In Thy light shall we see light." Is that the we are basically when we look to God, we are seeing our highest level of identity. And in so doing, we are also seeing the emanations of God. And through beholding joy, love, law, energy, order, life, justice, and beauty, through kind of getting these transcendentals to reside within our hearts and souls. And it's not just like John Calvin said, it's not just a gospel of the tongue, but a doctrine. It's not just a doctrine of the tongue, but it has to infuse itself within your heart. So, in thy light shall we see light. That means we are assimilating God's light into our being through these transcendentals. And then we are able to kind of behold the infinite unity of everything in creation. Next, you have the kind of garments of God. This is, God takes on these garments. God ultimately, in his ultimate way of existence, is the essence. God is just to be. God is the I am of reality that resonates throughout the cosmos. But then God takes on the garments in order such that he can become a creator God of a real universe, rather than this kind of having this more abstract existence. He wants to be a creator. So he puts on these garments, he puts on his clothes, and for here I put the at the end of the book of Deuteronomy. It has an affirmation of God's goodness, just like it did in the first chapter of Genesis, where it said God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very good. Also, at the very end of the 5 books of Moses says, the rock, perfect is thy work. Is that everything here, even though there's been a lot of things that have gone bad, everything's okay. The rock is perfect. His work is perfect. His creation is perfect. We've got nothing to worry about. And we need to see the perfection, even when things look terrible. And people might say, oh, well, there's genocide and war and hunger. And that is absolutely true. But you have to see that as an imperfect stage of perfection. And that's a really interesting place to be, is that you need to think about that if you take everything into it, we can't be aloof from other suffering. God forbid. We need to do everything we can. And it's actually the purpose of our life in some way to alleviate the suffering of others. But we can't let that take our eyes away from the beauty, perfection, and transcendent, ultimate purpose of reality, which is, if you take everything into account from the alpha to the omega, from the beginning to the end of existence, this reality is perfectly structured. The rock, perfect is thy work. Deuteronomy 32:4. So I associated that with the attributes of mercy and peace. And then below that, you have the actual way that God's presence infuses itself within the world. You have this world of creation and the programming world that creates the world of creation proximately, but ultimately God is beyond that as well. So I put here, quote, later in the books of the prophets by Isaiah, and this is talking to the Israelites, and he's reminding them that God is the creator of everything in the cosmos. Look up on high and see. Look at the stars, the galaxies, and just really consider. And if you see this, you'll actually be brought to a contemplation of the infinity and the creation of God almost without fail. Look up on high and see. Who created these? He who sends out their hosts by count, who calls them each by name, that God is friends with the stars, and we should be too. So I associated this with kingdom, with malchut, with presence, shekhinah, and with power, which is God's potency. God's, rather than simply being actual, God is also able to potentialize himself. And that is basically what we mean when we say power, is that God affects the self-configuration of reality through his presence in the creation, and does this to create his kingdom. And then finally, I have one of my favorite verse. For some reason, this one just sticks out to me from the Gospel of John. It says, "In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you." So basically, this is saying that there is a home for us within God. It's that God is loving. God is and God reciprocates that love to those who love him. So how do you live within the teleology of the one infinite creator? What does this expect of you? Pursue universal, it's simple. Pursue universal love in your mind, wisdom in your body, and freedom in your spirit. And then in thy light shall we see light, and we will be brought to, and you will inspire others to follow within the teleology and the path of God. So thank you. Let the light shine forth in the darkness. May the peace of our Father in heaven be upon you. Like and subscribe. Peace.